Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about all of the books that I read in May. I feel like the month was pretty varied as far as genres go, and for the most part I really enjoyed everything that I read. There were some exceptions, but we'll get right on into it and I'll let you know what those were. Okay, so the first book I picked up this month was for the Read Your Bookshelf Challenge that Chantel from Chantel Reads All Day puts on. And the prompt that I am on for that was a new to you author. And so I picked up Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. And I really enjoyed this. I don't know why it took me so long to pick up a Robin Hobb book, but I'm so glad that I finally did. This is more of a character-driven novel versus a plot-driven novel, and nothing really happened until the last few chapters. But even so, I loved it. These characters could be mucking out a horse stall. They could be doing absolutely nothing. They could be having the most boring interaction whatsoever, and I'd be here for it because they were great. I loved the characters. But for those that don't know, this is a fantasy book, and it's the first in a series, and it features Fitz, who is the illegitimate child of a prince, and he lives on the castle grounds, but he lives in the stable. He's raised by the stable hand, and he's kind of gruff, and he's an outcast. Fitz is an outcast, and nobody really likes him. They merely tolerate his existence, and he is actually secretly being trained by the king, his grandfather, in the art of assassins, and he's learning how to become an assassin. And that part was really interesting as well. But he's an assassin's apprentice, go figure. But and he has this magic in him called the skill, and he's learning how to use that secretly because his grandfather wants to use him as a weapon because their coast is getting bombarded by these enemy raiders are coming in. And anyway, so he is a secret weapon, and he's learning how to be that secret weapon for his kingdom. But I really enjoyed this, and if you haven't picked up a Robin Hobb, I would suggest picking this one up for sure. Okay, so the next two books I'm going to talk about are the two books that I chose to read in May for the classics that I want to read this year. I picked 24 classics that I had on my shelf that I hadn't read, and I was going to read 2 a month. And so far I've stuck to it. I'm really proud of myself for sticking to all of my reading goals so far. But okay, this book is kind of like one of those books that I guess you're glad you checked off, but my gosh, I will never read this again. The next book I read was The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, and it's not going to be on my shelf anymore. It's a doozy. The language in this book is atrocious, and I'm not sure if we've had a conversation about this, but I don't really notice language a whole lot in books unless it's prolific, and this was prolific. It was out of control, ridiculous. But it was on my shelf for $2.95, you can see from my case, and it's gonna go back to my case the next time I go because it's not for me. So this is just, it's a book about a young boy at a boarding school, and he's had some trauma. He's had some trauma in his life, and because of that trauma, he is making really atrocious choices, and it's just going about his life and his issues and all of these things. And I've heard it described as like a whiny teenager, but I don't know. I don't get the angst really. I get more tragic. Like he has had something tragic happen to him, and he kind of has just been brushed aside by teachers and his parents and his family, and nobody's really dealt with the issue that he has. And so he's just kind of projecting, you know what I mean? He's just projecting this issue. But this is a coming of age story that I do not need my children to read. Like, there's no reason. This is I don't know, you know, it's just one of those books where I think I'm a one and done for this author if the language is like this in his other books. It just wasn't for me. It just was not for me. Okay, so the next classic I picked up was Hard Times by Charles Dickens. And this is the first Dickens book that I've read outside of A Christmas Carol. That was weird. And I've always thought that Dickens was kind of inaccessible outside of A Christmas Carol. And that's why I've never picked him up. I thought the language would be hard to understand. I thought it would be kind of difficult. But it wasn't. It was much more accessible than I thought it would be. And so I'm really glad that I've just picked one up and started. And this one is fairly thin. I think it's one of his shorter works. But this is about Thomas Gradgrind, I think is his name. And he is a schoolmaster. And he is all about facts and statistics and logic. And he raises his children that way. And it kind of backfires on him, and you watch the progression of his children's lives and the choices that they make, and how at the end he kind of feels responsible for those choices because he is their father, you know. And at the same time, it's also looking at, what is his name? Stephen Blackpool? What is his name? Sorry, I am bad with names. It's Stephen Blackpool. I feel like that's right, but Stephen Blackpool. I was right. Okay, sorry. It's also featuring Stephen Blackpool, who is a worker in the mill, and he leads a tough life. And so they're kind of like these parallels are going, and then they meet and they both affect the other party. And it's just, I don't know, it was really interesting. It was actually a pretty immersive read. I got into it pretty well. I never had to force myself to pick it up. So I'm really glad that I read my first Charles Dickens. Okay, so the next book I picked up was Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. And this is a reread for me. And I'm reading the whole series again, and Era 2 with Tiffany, who's doing a read-along over on her channel, Beautiful Minutia. And so this was such a good reread. I really enjoyed these characters. I forgot a lot of it. I read this book in 2020 for the first time, and I had forgotten a lot of the details. My daughter was actually reading it with me, and she put it down. She wasn't feeling it, and so she put it down. She didn't finish. And I'm kind of glad that she did, because there were some things in there that I was like, oh, I forgot about that. We're going to have a conversation about that, because there were just some issues about Ven, because Ven is the main character and she lives on the streets. And so there are things that happen to her on the streets that are not great, and they happen to people around her, you know, and they're not great. But this is just such a good world, and I'm really excited to be back in this world. Okay, so the last book that I read for like a particular reason was for my in-person book club, and we read Surprised by Oxford by Carolyn Weber. And this is a memoir of the author's time at Oxford, and she came to Oxford as an atheist, and spoiler, she left a Christian. So this is all about her faith journey and the questions that she asks. And I really enjoyed the literary aspects of this book and the way that you feel so immersed in the streets of Oxford and all of that. I did have a few complaints. One of my complaints was it did feel a little bit too literary for me for a memoir. It felt, the conversations especially felt really fictionalized, and that kind of bothered me. Another thing that bothered me was she referred to this guy in the book as TDH, tall, dark, and handsome, the entire book, and that just kind of irked me. It just kind of got irritating to read, but that was just, you know, a little nitpick of it. But I really did enjoy her faith journey. It was definitely a very intellectual and an analytical journey to faith, because she is an academic, and so a lot of the things that were hard for her to grasp were interesting. Not grasp, but like, you know, come to terms with as far as Christianity. It was really interesting to hear her take on it and her process. And I really enjoyed the friendships in this too. These friendships were great because they were just here for her. Whether they were Christians or not, they were here for her and her journey. And I really, really enjoyed that. Okay, so the next book I'm going to talk about, I don't have because I lent it out. And this one, I really read because I thought I would hate it. And it is Shark Heart. And the premise of this book is these two newlyweds are very early on in their marriage. I think not even a year in. And the husband finds out that he has an incurable disease. And that disease turns him into a great white shark. So, the book is all about their process, like dealing with this diagnosis and life during the diagnosis and after the diagnosis, like, and some of the parts, like where he's turning into a great white shark, were ridiculous. Okay, they were ridiculous. He's literally turning into a shark, and he's talking about things about turning into a shark that literally made me laugh out loud. It's just so ridiculous. And so that pulled me out of the story every time, because this man is turning into a shark. And there are other characters that also have kind of similar diagnosis. And literally almost every time I'm like, are you kidding me? Here we go again. Someone's turning into an animal. It's just going to be a zoo. And it pulled me out of the story. But, this is a big but, I think I went in with such low expectations. I went in thinking that I was going to hate this book, that I was going to loathe this book, that there were going to be no redeemable qualities whatsoever about this book. And I actually was very pleasantly surprised. Outside of the ridiculousness, if I could kind of like forget about that and just assume that he had a different diagnosis, like a normal human diagnosis, I really enjoyed the book. It was a very, I thought, well done look at the long goodbye. You know, like someone gets a diagnosis from the doctor and you go through all of those emotions like anger and hurt and then acceptance and all of those things. And towards the end, you're like, would you just turn into the shark already? But then you're also still heartbroken. You know what I mean? So, I don't know. I was pleasantly surprised. I passed it on to Tiffany from Beautiful Minutia, and I know that she's going to have lots of thoughts, and I cannot wait to hear her thoughts. So, I'm sure they're not like mine. I'm shocked that I liked it, and we're going to pass it around our book club for whoever wants to read it, and we're all writing notes into it. So, it's like Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, but a book. So, it's going to be fun. For the last person to read it, especially because there will be all of the notes from everybody in there. But it's just, you know, a fun thing that we wanted to do because we thought it sounded absolutely ridiculous. And I fully expect that I will be the only one that actually likes it. But I'm okay with it. I'm kind of embarrassed, but I'm okay with it. Anyway, pick it up if you want to read something kind of weird. The next book I read was Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk. And I also loved this one. This is about an elderly lady who lives in New York City, and it's New Year's Eve, and she lives alone. Her children are grown. Her son is grown, and she takes a walk to dinner. And it's kind of every stop she makes, she's reminiscing on her younger days in New York and how the neighborhood has changed since then, but how it also has kind of stayed the same. And I love walking books, fiction or non. And I don't know, I just really enjoyed it. It was a really nice book. And then in the author's notes, I found out that it's actually inspired by a poet and ad woman, Margaret Fishback. Never heard of her, but she worked for Macy's. And so the book is inspired from her life. So I thought that was kind of neat too. It was a neat little thing. And because it's taking you through her life, it's talking about her days, because she also writes ads and jingles for Macy's. And so it talks about how advertising itself changes over the years. And I don't know, I just found it very interesting. Okay, so the last set of books that I read, I'm trying to, the last few days of the month, just not start a new book. I kind of like the feeling of ending a month on a clean slate, like not having any holdovers, and starting fresh the next month. So what I've been doing the last few days of the month, I've been reading manga or graphic novels, just something light and quick, so like little fillers. And so the last few days of May, I read the entire Amulet series. There are 9 books in the series. And I gotta say, I really enjoyed this series. So if you don't know what the premise is these 2 kids, their brother and sister, they have a tragic experience happen to them on the very first few pages. And they, because of that incident, they have to move. And they move and they move to this house that was in their family for a while, and it's just kind of old and run down, and they're going to live there with their mom. And something happens, and their mom gets taken. So they have to find their mom. And then in the subsequent books, it goes on, and they just continue to have an adventure. It turns into, we've got to save our mom, to we've got to save the whole world. And it was just fun. I really enjoyed it. The art is awesome. Anyway, so I really enjoyed this series, and I'm glad I finally picked it up. I think my daughter read a few of these many years ago, but she never finished the series. I don't think she has any interest in finishing it now, but I enjoyed it. Okay, so those are all the books that I read this month. Like I said, I had a really good reading month outside of like The Catcher in the Rye. I think that's the only book that I disliked. And I feel like it was across the board as far as genres go. A few fantasies, a few classics, some literary fiction, a memoir, some graphic novels. I feel like I did pretty good. But anyway, thanks for watching. I'd love to hear what you read in March. Have you read any of these books? Do you like them? Have you read Shark Heart? What are your thoughts on that one? Because that one I feel like is going to be polarizing. And I'd like to know where you end up on that. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.